Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of Podcast Unflooded. Today, I am joined by a special guest, the Lorulean Historian. Unfortunately, my co host Alexander, my regular co host, was not able to make it today, but he did send me some questions to ask. Historian, would you like to introduce yourself and your content?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Lorulean Historian. I also go by MrJmZack, and yeah, I've been involved in the Zelda community and gaming community and art community for a number of years. I've been assisting different Zelda YouTuber theorists with gathering content, translating Japanese. I've done various maps, diagrams, timeline, schematics, all sorts of things over the last several years. And yeah, I'm just love it, and I'm happy to be here today.
Well, I'm happy for you to be here too, of course. Anyone that's familiar with the channel, of course, may be extra familiar with one of your maps. Of course, you drew the reference map that I've been using as the basis for Wind Waker Unflooded. I mean, I'd love to kind of ask you just a little bit about the origin of that map specifically, if I could.
Sure. Yeah. So I originally posted that in 2013, shortly after the Wind Waker HD released. I was on a Wind Waker binge at the time. I actually uh, pre-ordered the Wind Waker HD special Wii U edition, specifically for the game at the time. The Wind Waker was always one of my favorites, not only my favorite Zelda game at the time, but also just one of my favorite games in general. I used to play it regularly on the GameCube. Um, so yeah, I was really excited to get into it on the Wii U, and I've tried mapping the world of Hyrule beneath the waves on several occasions prior. Most of them never made it to the internet. Um, I've always been really curious to see or imagine what that world would have been like, what the references would have been like, the different spaces, because it implies in the game that it's this vast land that we were more familiar with, say, Ocarina of Time, but we only ever see little slivers of it, and it's so tantalizingly close, but yet so far. And so, yeah, I decided to put some of my artistic skills to the test and imagined what the world would have looked like based upon Ocarina of Time, what we could see in the Wind Waker, and yeah, using the islands of the Great Sea as references for the mountain chains, and just worked at it from there.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I'd love to ask too, because I guess, you know, thinking about that iterative process, you mentioned that like you've been thinking about that world and there were a couple of versions of the map that didn't make it to air. Do you remember specifically what about those versions, like what made you unhappy with them and made you redraw it until the version that you ended up with?
A lot of it had to do with Um, mostly orientation, trying to imagine where certain landscapes and landmarks were in relation to Hyrule Castle and Ganon's Castle. Um, I wasn't sure as we first descend upon the world beneath the waves what direction we're facing. So
Hmm.
from there, you know, where is the river coming into the lake from? Where is Ganon's castle? Is it to the east? Is it to the north? Is it to the west? I wasn't sure, so I had tried various iterations of that. Um, a lot of them were more general, so I hadn't filled in a lot of the other details on the map. It was pretty much just the orientation of the castle, Hyrule Field, and where those landmarks were. And then once I felt happy with that, especially in the Wind Waker HD, I took several screenshots. I took several game capture recordings to try and get as detailed as possible and figure out what direction we're facing as we go under, and then just worked from there.
Interesting. I definitely think it's the most intuitive because there were several versions of, I guess that premise, like as far as like drawn out 2D maps about like how does the world of Hyrule connect with the islands of the Great Sea? And I really felt like yours was. I mean, it was to me it was the most beautiful and the most um, intuitive as far as all that directionality. So I definitely think that that paid off because that question, and it's definitely it comes like yeah. I mean, there's always how do I put it? The world of Hyrule in its geography always creates problems. So
Oh
no
yeah.
matter what way you spin it, there's going to be questions and issues. Um, and I know I've dealt with the community about like questions about like, well, we want Ganon's Tower to exist in a desert. We see it in a desert in the game, but it's not Gerudo Desert because of the orientation.
Hmm.
And I'm sticking with that, and that's per your original map. But even within the game, there's nothing to suggest, even though it is a desert, it's also mountainous, and there's nothing suggesting that it is Gerudo Desert
Yeah.
specifically.
And with that in mind, one of the reasons I figured that it was in that general direction, based again upon how we enter the world beneath the waves, um, I just chalked it up to a reference to Spectacle Rock and Death Mountain from the original games because that's the closest major landmark in that general direction. Um, on the Great Sea, I would imagine that would be Fire Mountain and Dragon Roost Island. So that's what I went with. But yeah, it's the desert itself that we see, the little bit that we see when we're actually on the tower isn't very large, and there's no other defining features that would suggest that it is specifically Gerudo Desert. So yeah, I would agree with that. That's why I put it where I put it on the map.
Mhm. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. I'd like to get into a couple of questions too that my co-host left for me. So in his absence, I'll be reading his questions. Um, Alex asked. So just continuing on Wind Waker Unflooded for a minute, and then I want to kind of get into some of your other theories too. Um, but he asked, so Joe has used your map. How much of the actual landscape and structures of your version of Hyrule did you originally picture? And is there anything Joe added in that surprised you so far?
Hmm. Well, so I've been following your channel obviously for a while, ever since as pretty much ever since you had asked to use the map, and as soon as I started seeing postings. Um, I've been really surprised with a lot of the different details you've added, especially ones from, say, newer games like Breath of the Wild, because obviously those weren't a thing when I designed the map in the first place. So seeing those additions into the world and how honestly how seamless they are with it and how much they make sense has been a lot of fun. Um, as we sort of discovered the other day when I was posting in the server, there were some details that I had on the map, the original map, that didn't quite make it into the final version because of pixel fidelity and whatnot. They were harder to see. Um, Having Outset Island's village originally, I placed it near the base of the mountain, some place between where Outset Island itself is and where the Earth Temple is located as of the present. Um, so south of Lake Hylia in my map. I never really imagined that the village would have been still up on the mountain. I figured it would have been on a plain, just like a lot of the other towns. But seeing the Outset Island even just expanded upon is a lot of fun. I really like your take on that.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, that's definitely, you know, I mean, I sometimes debate, with myself and with the community with a lot of these kind of questions as well, because there are things that like, I mean, it's getting into like, does this really make sense for just kind of asking like, what is made post flood, what was created pre flood, and with a lot of these developing, villages, it's like there's things that like we just don't know or just don't quite make sense to me intuitively. Even though this project for me, Wind Waker Unflooded, is all about reimagining Hyrule before the flood, it's also like it is about lowering the water level and seeing more of this overworld that I love. And so, with that in mind, it's like I want to preserve Wind Waker's decisions and say, well, it has Outside Islands vision, like village. I want to expand that because that's really also part of the core of the project, even if that doesn't always make sense lore wise.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I appreciate your thoughts about that. Alex also asked, how do you feel about the current direction of the Legend of Zelda series? And if there's one thing you could change about it, what would it be?
Oh, geez. Now that's a tough one. Um, Personally, I've absolutely adored Breath of the Wild, and I am still obsessed with Tears of the Kingdom. Um, I know it's been kind of divisive in the community. There are people who love it, and there are people who absolutely hate it. Um, Me, I'm one of the ones that loves it. Obviously, it's not without flaws or faults. The biggest thing I could see is basically how the storytelling goes. They took cues from Breath of the Wild, using the memories, and there's a little bit of guidance that kind of tells you like this is the order that you should find these in, but then have them haphazardly across the map. So people are finding them in out of sequence, that they're being found out of order, so it kind of ruins some of the suspense and some of the buildup for this backstory, and the origins of the light dragon and how everything came to be in the present of the story. So I would say that would be one thing that I would change. I mean, I love the open air open world concept. I love how creative the games have been, but having at least a little more linearity, at least when it comes to the story points. Um, Even if, for example, maybe you find a particular cutscene or a particular story, um, maybe it's locked behind something that you have to do first, whether that's gather a certain kind of item or beat a particular dungeon, then you get access to that area so that it would at least follow a steady progression in terms of story. Because when you're telling a story, it makes sense to have that sort of build up. We lost you there for a second.
Excuse me, somebody tried to call me. I need to put my phone on do not disturb. But I totally agree with what you were saying there. Excuse me. We're coming back to the podcast there. If there was a little blip, um, someone tried to call my phone and they kicked me out of the meeting for a second. But Lorulean, I totally agreed with your point that you were making. And I guess I just want to ask if there's any other kind of things you want to say, I guess, about criticizing the direction of Tears of the Kingdom. Because I totally agree with your points about the linearity of the story. I think it really could have benefited from that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's really the one thing that I would change. I mean, everything else, it's 11 out of 10 for me. But when it comes to actually delivering the story and the build up and the progression towards the climax, it falls a little short. That would really be the only thing that I would change if they kept this formula moving forward.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I guess I'm curious because you started your response talking about the divisiveness of Tears of the Kingdom. And I think it's interesting because to me, that's not something I really noticed until like I feel like I got like even further into like the Zelda lore like community and especially in analyzing the lore. I feel like there is a difference between the general Zelda fan population and when you really start getting into the lore and comparing it to your own theories, and everyone has their own theory. And so when a new game comes out, sometimes it's like it's not just ooh new Zelda. I like Zelda. Sometimes it's like oh no, this jeopardizes all of these theories that I've come up with. And I know that you're someone who's done a lot of theories for a while. So I kind of love that your response to Tears of the Kingdom is like it is like as positive as it is. I think that's really cool.
Thank you. I mean, I had a lot of theories going into this game. A lot, especially that I had built up from Breath of the Wild, in particular about the Zonai. Um, I was actually one of the first people, at least in terms of YouTube community, to actually post anything about the Zonai. I posted in March, or end of March, early April of 2017, talking about the Pharaon jungle and the barbarians and using the term Zonai, um, and trying to at least build up a basis of like, this is a really cool mystery that we should try solving. And then it just exploded. Everyone was talking about the Zonai for a few years there. It got to the point that it was a meme. And yeah, I kind of feel I kind of feel that I fueled a lot of that, especially since I was helping and communicating with a lot of different people in the theorizing community. Um, yeah, it was a really interesting time. It was a good time. Um, and I had a few, I'll call them tinfoil hat theories about the Zonai, leading into into Tears of the Kingdom. Sorry. Um, and I feel I got a few good hits. I got a few things right. But I got a few things like I just feel like, wow, how did I miss that? Or like, wow, this is completely different from what I imagined, but I love it. So yeah, no,
Yeah,
it's great. I love this game.
well, I mean, I totally love it too, and it's nice to share that positivity because I feel like I've just seen so many people just so frustrated with the lore, and so I guess I want to ask about like especially specifically you talk about the Zonai, and I saw your video with where you were talking to Moxie Watts about Sky People. That was a great discussion, and so I mean, it seems to me I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like Tears of the Kingdom is not the game that like oh no it's throwing a wrench in the lore. It's this game that kind of finally unified all these pieces of lore that like we had seen in other games, and now it's like it's all coming together, and we have names and faces to these ideas that have only kind of been hinted at.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's basically what I feel about it, and I think that's why I've remained so positive. Um, I think in general, a lot of the um, bigger theorists and players in the theorizing community had a lot of different expectations, a lot of high expectations, maybe some slightly unrealistic expectations going in, and when they started, especially right off the bat in the beginning of the game, it's talking about the imprisoning war. It's talking about this is what the Zonai looked like, and they're completely different from anything we've ever seen. Um, yeah, it threw a lot of wrenches into their ideas and into their beliefs going in. And I think a lot of them couldn't reconcile or see past that initial like, oh, and actually see like all of the commonalities and all of the threads that, yeah, seem to have been drawn and pulled together from various sources throughout the series, especially over the last 15, 20 years. That seems to, you know, um, build up to this moment. Um, that's what I love about it. Like, at least in terms of lore, um, and it still keeps you guessing. That's one of the interesting things about it. Um, I mean, it talks about the founding of the kingdom of Hyrule by a race of beings that are considered to be closer to the gods than the Hylians, which is exactly how the Uka or the sky beings were described in Twilight Princess. You've got all of these other references and all of these other races all coexisting in Hyrule. You have the Rito and the Zora. And so people are like, wait, I thought the Rito came from the Wind Waker and from the flood. So, like, is this post flood? Did Hyrule get refounded? There's so many questions that are involved in it. So, either history is repeating itself or we didn't know all of the facts. And now we're finally starting to get some light shed on the moment of when the Kingdom of Hyrule was founded, which in either case is really exciting. I'm not like, oh, what is this? I'm like, wow, this is awesome.
Hmm. I mean, that's totally how I feel too. And you talked in your discussion with Moxie too about like how Nintendo is pulling from all kinds of real world historical examples as well, especially in mythology and religion. And I mean, they're pulling from things all over the globe in this discussion of Sky People and the Zonai, and they're depicted differently throughout the series. And I do wonder, especially for Western audiences, I guess, do you think that? I mean, Western audiences often have a very Judaic Christian lens. Do you think that that colors the way that we read Zelda lore and kind of the gaps that we fill in?
I think so. I mean, culture is integral to wherever you are in the world. Um, Obviously, the way Japan and the developers live, they are used to Shinto and Buddhist and um, Eastern cultural influences and religions, and that's obviously going to color a lot of what they create and a lot of what they do. It's part of their life. So yeah, on our end, there is a lot of Abrahamic Judeo-Christian coloring that occurs in a lot of our worldviews and a lot of our perceptions. Even if you aren't a Christian or a Catholic, it's so ingrained into our culture here in the West that it's hard to ignore it. It's just there. Um, so absolutely, depending on where you are, if you're in the East or you're in the West, your particular culture and how you perceive the world and how the game itself presents what's there, the localization teams, how they interpret some of these or some of these dialogue boxes, or even reinterpret and reinvent some, because they do kind of wash over certain more nuanced aspects that were, blatantly stated in the Japanese original text, and reinvent it for our Western audiences. So it does, yeah, absolutely. It changes our perception of a lot of these moments and a lot of this lore.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'd like to ask specifically because I guess I see a difference in the way that Ocarina of Time presents its creation story. To me, that feels very much like Genesis, and I see like I mean I think specifically even all the elements of the Triforce that were important in some of the older games. That feels very much like the Trinity to me in the way. I mean, there's aspects of it that are like that. But then you get in discussions of the sacred realm and the Twilight realm, and that's not analogous with a Judaic Christian worldview of like what is the afterlife like or heaven. And I guess I'm curious because the sacred realm and like what that is something that in my discussions with my friends like I have no idea like how to parse like what is how does that make sense throughout the series. I'd love to kind of ask you your take on the sacred realm.
Okay. So my understanding of the sacred realm or the sacred land, in Japanese, it's referred to as Seichi. Um, it is a term that is used and applied to virtually any particular place where the Triforce came to rest. So whether that was in the physical plane, the realm of Hyrule, or what would one day become known as Hyrule, it's referred to as a sacred land or the sacred realm on more than one occasion. The sacred realm, as we know it from Ocarina of Time or from A Link to the Past, appears to be a separate dimension, a separate plane of existence that reflects the physical world, but isn't quite the same. In A Link to the Past, for instance, it mentions how Ganondorf or Ganon is bound there. There's limits to how far he can go. So his wish had influenced the sacred realm to become this dark world, this dark reality, but it seems to have a boundary. It only extends so far. So it's like a little pocket dimension. Um, but this pocket dimension is intrinsically linked to the physical world of Hyrule. It's only accessible from specific points in the kingdom of Hyrule. Um, but it's very much a spiritual place and a physical place. It's a weird amalgamation of the two. So yeah, it is hard to sort of pinpoint precisely what it is. But yeah, the term itself is used for pretty much any place that the Triforce has been kept.
That's a good answer. Thanks for getting into that question because I guess I've wondered like because I mean within Christianity for instance like there's a pretty much a hard barrier between Earth and heaven But I think about some of Greek mythology, right? And there's a lot more stories about even there's a place where the dead go, but that's also a place that the living can you can still that's a place you can travel to and then come back out of. And I wonder if the sacred realm exists more as a place like that you can travel between, even if it's also in some ways sometimes like related to the afterlife.
It's
Yeah,
a
no, definitely. It's one of those weird in between spaces. It's sort of a liminal space. Yeah, definitely like the Greek underworld or even Olympus. I mean,
Mhm.
Olympus was a physical place, but it was also not a physical place. It was the realm of the gods and it was very hard to access, but you could go there.
Right, right. It was a very much a real place, right?
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've heard and I don't know if this is one scholar, but I've heard Bart Ehrman talk about even when Jesus referred to what's translated as hell in the New Testament, this idea that he was referring to a plain outside of Jerusalem. And there's a question of like how much when he talked about hell was that always meant to be a physical place? Was he saying that that place was hell, or was that always metaphorical? And then sometimes it's like there's so much time removed from you know the language that it's hard to actually tell what they're meaning.
Yeah. I mean, that's like anything. If you're even now, if you're communicating with somebody via text, you lose a lot of the context. You might not know if someone was being literal, metaphorical. Um, you easily miss a lot of those cues. And then if you are actually having a conversation with somebody and you do get that context, how do you share that with somebody else without losing some of that, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, especially with over 2000 years between the time of the event and now, yeah, it's really hard to pinpoint what precisely was meant.
Yeah, and to tie that back to Zelda, I mean, like we're still dealing with a language barrier with translations, and I guess like I'd like to just ask, like, because you've talked about Japanese translation. This is we're getting into the end of the podcast. So this will be one of my final questions. Um, but I guess I'd like to ask, is there anything that you feel like is a common misconception that a lot of people who read the English translations of the games, the localized versions, are there any common misconceptions that they don't miss because they don't know what's actually in Japanese?
Ooh, that's a good one. I know one in particular that gets brought up a lot is the final words of demise from Skyward Sword.
Mm.
So the curse of the demon tribe. Um, some of it that's lost in localization is the fact that demise is actually referring to samsara, which is a Hindu Buddhist conception of birth, death, and rebirth or reincarnation. It's a very specific process. The way he describes it in Japanese, the curse that's existing is the fact that the demons are continuously being reborn over and over and over again, and that it's something that affects them. Then he binds the spirit of the hero and the blood of the goddess to it in the sense that no matter where they are or when they are, an incarnation of his hatred and his malice, his grudge against the gods, is going to follow them and basically mess with their futures forever. It's never going to end. It's a cycle without end. So people see that and in localization they interpret it as he specifically cursed Link and Zelda or people who are like them. Where if you're reading into the nuance of it and reading that information in Japanese and looking into what samsara is, it colors it very differently. It's less of a curse and more of a promise, and he's saying that it's going to happen because this is something that's already happening. It's
Mm.
something he's already undergoing. It's something all of the monsters and demons are undergoing.
Interesting. So it seems like it's more of a statement on what is already a part of kind of the natural world. It's less like, oh,
Precisely.
I'm going to be reincarnated. It's not a statement on, on his reincarnation specifically, but evil exists. It will continue to exist in this land.
Exactly.
That's interesting. That's really interesting.
Mhm.
That's awesome. I mean, we're almost at the end of time. I guess I'd like to just kind of ask: is there anything you'd like to promote? Any projects you're working on, or anything else that you have to say about any lore you've been interested in, or Wind Waker Unflooded? Any closing thoughts?
Sure. So I recently had a wonderful discussion on a live stream with Game Smiths and OG Oaf Gaming, where we talked about a lot of different theories and topics with Tears of the Kingdom and Zelda in general. So I want to give a shout out to them because that was an awesome time, and we are planning to do some more in the future. So keep an eye out for that if you're so inclined or so interested. Um, I'm always on Twitter, and definitely always on Discord. I'm in a lot of different servers, a lot of different chat rooms, and I'm always, willing to discuss and eager to discuss theories and lore and translation requests. So hit me up. It's Lorulean Historian or at TGL Medora on Instagram and Twitter. And yeah, I just want to say thank you, Joe, for having me and asking some amazing questions. I was really happy to be here and be a part of this, and I will continue to know keep updated with your progress. And if you need any help, if there's anything that comes up, let me know. Send me a message, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for being a part of the podcast. This has been an amazing discussion. Really encouraging everyone. Y'all heard what he said, so feel free to check all of that out. And links to channels will be in the description. Y'all, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next episode. Peace and love.